Okay, so after coming up with the final design and testing ways in which I was making the figure, I already knew what type of marks I wanted as I tested that before I went on to make my final piece. So again, I was testing marks on different types of fabrics just to be sure that that's what I wanted within my piece. And here's some examples. So these were just large scale. And this sheer fabric here, I like the wavy motions, as this could represent the movement, the tiredness with the slow motions, more of an emotionless movement behind that one. So the lines were just everywhere, there wasn't really a meaning behind it. And as well here, there's the blues, the blacks and the pinks all mixed together. There's some yellow and blue in there as well. And this was using the whole spectrum of colours that I selected out in my colour palette in the criteria. And this piece here, I feel it looks good, it looks nice, but I don't feel like it represents what I'm looking for. I feel like there's too much white within the fabric and the paint used. I feel like this gives it more of a natural look, or like a peaceful look, which I don't feel needs representing within my piece. So although the fabric and the pattern is quite nice and I do like it, I don't think it's suitable for my piece, as I want it to be more rustic. And even with the blue and the hiding with the two sides of the emotions, so the inside and outside, I feel like that's too natural, because I want the depression to seep into the outside as well, because it's not always hidden. I do like these bits and the blockness of them, but I don't like the background and the use of the yellow. I feel like it's too bold and takes away from the marks themselves. I do feel it's a nice background, although it is quite a smooth one, so you don't get the texture as much like when using the calico. And yeah, so the marks here again, they're quite slow, quite wobbly, just overlapping to represent the tiredness, the not caring that depression would bring on. In there I've added white as well to like uplift the spirits and use different motions. So yeah. Okay, I moved on to some other testing samples. So these were with paper and lace spray paint onto lace. So here I used I've got blue and black spray paint and then a pink lace print, just using normal paint painted onto the lace and then printed over. I used the lace as a stencil and it looks messy and quite destructive and could represent the brokenness of depression, which I do quite like. And with the splashes of paint over the top as well, it layers up and it doesn't take away too much. Even though it is a stencil and a pattern, you can't specifically focus on what the pattern is, and I do think it looks quite nice. And as well as that, you can lift the lace slightly from the fabric, lift it up slightly, and this gives it another couple of inches to spray and be less specific and less stenciled. So again, that's another look which is like less polished and it's a bit more messy, which is the look that I am wanting to represent depression with. Okay, so again down here, this was just a print onto the blue paint with a bit of clear tracing paper. I like the look this gives. With the clear you can see the patterns underneath and you can see the design underneath it. And again, it's really messy, it's broken, there's rips coming through, and I just feel like the messiness and the marks represent the lack of confidence and the lack of caring that people have when they have depression. They don't care, and I feel like the messiness and the not caring of the marks themselves represent this in a nice way. So yeah, that's those ones. Again, I did a couple more samples. These ones, there's the pink and yellowy one up here. I used some blue in the background as well. I feel like the yellow in this one is too overpowering. I feel like it's too sunshine and too optimistic. So I don't mind the use of yellow slightly, but I want to tone it back. I don't want to be using overly too much yellow, as it takes away and it stops the eye focusing on the darkness in the background and the marks, and as it's been drawn to the bright yellow at the foreground or in the lighter sections of the piece. Yeah, too optimistic and too bright and colourful when I added the yellow in. These pieces here, so this one specifically, it looks too block, so there's no texture in it, there's no layering up of the marks, there's not really much movement, just straight lines. I do like the texture that comes from the raggedness at the edges, but I feel like the piece is too block, as it's only got 2 shades of colour which aren't very different. I could still use it, I'd just have to layer up a bit more with different textures and different paints on top to give the look that I'm wanting. And then down here there's the brown material with the blue paint on it, and I don't know if you can see, but it's more of a block amounts of colour which are then transferred over the rest of the fabric. I don't like this. I feel like the brown material, even though it's more of a goldy brown, which I thought could be interpreted as more of a yellow in the background, quite dull, quite dark, which would hide in if covered well. I don't think it belongs with the other samples, so I don't feel that they gel together as well as the other samples do together. I feel like it's just a bit too pow and strong and powerful, which isn't the look that I'm wanting. It's more discreet and in the subconscious, and this one's too strong and bold, so I don't really like the look of that one. And yeah, there's these 2 here. These were the marks that I dripped the paint onto the page. So I used the paint and I dripped it onto the page in the same style as Jackson Pollock. And this is before I messied it up. So I didn't just leave it like Jackson Pollock would. He left the paint and let it dry how it fell. I used the marks, then textured up and layered up on top of them to again add texture and add detail. And these specific ones were slow movements, really wobbly, just not really caring about the movement or the direction, just kind of getting the paint on there. This again to represent the tiredness. And some of the lines are quite enthusiastic in this one, even though with the slow and movements. So I'd have to grunge it up a bit and like remove that, as it's not giving the right emotion. And it's more happy than the slow and sad movement that I wanted. But yeah, so over here, after I did my samples and started with the textures and everything, I went on to laying out the large scale piece. So on here, this is the large scale piece, and to start with I used sheer fabric or just fabric in general, and as the paint was splattered on, the marks that it left underneath, I really like how it represented. It's as if the marks you're leaving behind, which I didn't really think about to start with, but it does relate back to the very first quote, how the marks you're leaving behind when you're leaving, other people having to deal with. So I did really like that, and I ended up using the marks from the original pieces, so the leftovers, and put them in the background of the other piece, as it gave the texture and the emotions that I wanted. This little piece here, patchy and not very consistent, could represent the not caring and emotional damage. And okay, so after looking into texture and the clothes, I did have the idea of linking clothes in somehow, as generally clothes are used for people to represent their emotions, so how they feel, what the outfit is trying to say, the colours, the interpreting how you're feeling, basically. So I did think about adding that in and just using the fabric within the piece. So I found like a quite nice toned pattern piece here, which could be used within just as a pattern piece. And then I also distressed some other fabrics as well, just using the paints and the same themes and the same marks within, and I'd see what the textures look like and if I could somehow incorporate it in just as another layer to dig into, basically. And yeah, some more samples of texture here. I used fabric and just distressed it using black paint and black and blue paint and inks. And this fabric specifically, it was like a woven, really thin woven fabric. So when the paint was on it and the inks was on it and it dried the way in a ball. If it was left in a ball, it would have dried in a ball and all together. So I spreaded it out, but within it you could still see where the creases were and how the fabric had like clumped together, which I really liked. It looked really distressed and dark and really represented the heaviness of the black, and I really liked the way that this turned out. It made it look more worn and tired compared to what it was to begin with, and I think it'll work really well within the design as it'll give that extra layer, especially with the dark black and the texture where it's set and everything as well. Okay, so with the design itself, I wanted to represent the design itself. I kind of went back and looked at the initial design ideas I made for the depression piece itself. So this one here, I really liked it was made from, I'd planned it to be made from sheer fabric so you could see through it, and then the tones would differ as it went backwards to represent the drowning feeling and the pressure that people feel when they have depression. So I really liked that concept, and I've kind of brought that back into the current concept. So I am wanting to use the two different sides, the light and the dark, but I want to mix that in as well, looking at the lighter shades, so the pinks and the whites at the top, the blues and the darker in the middle, and then the black at the bottom to represent the drowning feeling and the heaviness, as if they're sinking to the bottom of the ocean and it's heavy and they can't breathe, as this is how people are saying it feels, so how they feel and how they would like it represented. So within that I've used the marks again, so at the top there's more pink to represent happiness or the weakness within their physical self, but also the happy side, so you've got the double, the inside and outside emotions. And then along the top I did use more energetic movements to represent like happiness and energetic, as generally above the water you can splash about a bit, but then as the sink in it was just more dense and it was more together, and the tones got darker, there was less white moving, and yeah, I wanted to represent as if an ocean was on top of someone and they couldn't deal. So that was the backdrop mainly and the initial start off. So the other samples that I've done, I've wanted to add on top and then create the figure and weave it all in and incorporate it within that. So I moved on to, again, looking at spray paints and the effect that they give. So with the spray paints, I like the way they turned out, as it wasn't too overpowering. Having sprayed a little bit on the top here, well, the bottom, it had been down here, and it felt as though it was in the background and not on top of the design. And it was an easy way to fill in white patches that I didn't want seen at the bottom. So I wanted the bottom to be represented as dark, as cold, as heavy, which wouldn't be a good representation if there was little white patches of calico left uncovered. So with the spray paint, I was able to use the lace and cover it up and darken it up without just going black and without just adding no tones. I feel like it gave it a different emotion to kind of vamp it up a little bit, and it's in the background, so it's not overpowering the marks themselves made from ink, and it's just representing the heaviness that I wanted it to, or that I wanted the bottom to be represented by. I again tried it with the blue spray paint, and again it didn't take away from the marks, it added to them and it gave it another layer of colour, but also meaning, as it looks more distressed with the different colours and the patchwork, or so yeah. I tested out, before I used it on the sheet, I did test it out on a separate piece of calico, and the print using the pink, which I painted pink paint on top and printed with the lace instead, I did like better, as it gave a more textured look and it was more rougher and angrier. But I feel like using the paint would cover up the expressive marks which I'd laid at the bottom, and I would want to layer it up, but I feel like it's better using the softer colours and the softer lace with the spray paint down here, as it just makes it gentler, but it colours the background and it just enhances the drowned in motion that I was wanting to get across. So yeah, after hanging this up, I hung it up around a photo frame. So with this I could adjust how far I wanted at the bottom, how much black I wanted at the bottom, and how much excess fabric to light pool to then set the figure on and work that way. So yeah, just use bulldog clips there. This is when I started making the dummy or the mannequin or the figure. I didn't know what size to make it, so I did wrap it around a person to judge how much material I would need, but obviously the perks of using this wire was I could wrinkle it, I could crinkle it and compress it more so than the other, so I wasn't set on using the size, and if I needed to change it I could crumple it and distress it further to get the effect of distressed more so than the other one, which was quite prim and proper. Okay. So after I made the dummy, it was quite an issue hanging it or how to stand it. I did find this, and it would work if I placed the dummy on top of it, but the wire obviously being see-through, it would be very easy to see the frame underneath, and I think that would take away from the whole aspect and the look that I was going for. So we ended up tying it to one of the light fittings just above, and this was a really good way of dealing with the problem, as it meant that the figure could be lifted ever so slightly, so it would stand up straighter where it was quite slouched before, and it was just more of a presence than when it was slouched. So that's how we solved that issue. And then here's just the weaving into, using the fabric samples I created before with the marks on and everything. I ripped them up into small strips and just weaved them within the wireframe. An issue I found with this was that it created having the original design, I wanted the backdrop to link within and then the weaving to weave through. But the issue I found here was with the length of fabric that I would need to then attach it to the backdrop and weave it off and through the body would be extra long, as I didn't think I would need to weave it as much to get the effect that I wanted. I thought I would just have to weave it a couple of times and that would be fine. Whereas I ended up having to weave it almost right the way across the body, as this enhanced the effect and it made the body, the wire bodice, stand out more in front of the textured background. So I did that with the blue, and originally as well I didn't think about adding the pink and the yellow to the opposite side. I was just going to leave that clear and to represent a normal person, everyday, day-to-day person, just with the normal wire. But the same sense, not having the pink or the lighter weaving within the bodice, it was harder to see the figure. You couldn't really tell where the figure was, and it wasn't getting the point across as much as I would like it to. And with the pink lace, I then had to go back, use the emotions that I found regarding more happier emotions, and use the textures in the same type of fabric, just to enhance the both sides were different, rather than I was only just covering one side and they were both the same. So yeah, here's just some samples. I did try and use the fabric from the dress that I found, the texture, but because the fabric was already textured and patterned, it stood out from the rest and it didn't go, like the patterns didn't match, and it was too obvious what it was, or what it was, that it wasn't part of the others, or it wasn't part of a theme using the same marks and patterns. So I did have to take that out. But yeah, so this is just some of the work with the 3 different stripes representing the deeper, then the midway, and the quite light splashing at the top. At the bottom, like I said before, I wanted the darker pool at the bottom to represent the darkness which is seen. So again, I used the spray paint and sprayed over it just to texture up slightly here. And I do really like the effect that it gives, as it could even represent the stone floor, as it's quite cobbly. It could represent, again, the deepness and the darkness of the, so yeah. After stepping back and looking at the design itself, I realised that the bars used really took away from, the frame used really took away from the product itself. So this gave the effect that more focused on the bars than there were the actual piece. So what we did was I came up with an idea to attach the bar, which it was all hooked under, around the ventilation system, and just using string on clear fishing wire, just tie it over so we could then remove the poles at either side, and the effect it gives is just really good, as it focuses more on my designs. It brightens up the piece almost as the light, and it just stops the piece from feeling boxed in or claustrophobic. So I think that really enhanced my piece altogether. And as well, after removing the bars, I decided to spread out the piece further. So it started off quite contained and it just looked like strips in the background. So I spread them out and added to them as well, different strips and the marks left behind. And I just feel like it's representing more of a messy tone. It's representing just the distress that people go through when suffering with the mental illness. Okay.